Hi, my name is Mark Brower. I'm the host of The Recovery Journey and the editor of the blog sexualsanity.com. In this video today, we're going to give an overview of the term we're using, sexual struggle. Sometimes there could be a question about what is really happening in my sexual life. Is this a bad habit? Is this a compulsion? Is this an addiction? Sometimes there's confusion about the labels. Sometimes because of our shame and denial, we don't want to put ourselves in a certain category because we're trying to minimize what we're doing. Other times I think there's just really confusion about what it means to have an addiction. And frankly, there's controversy about whether addictions are a helpful label or category when we're talking about specific natural functions as opposed to illegal chemicals that we ingest into our system. So what is really going on in my sexual life? And maybe a more helpful way to think about this instead of a black and white either or categories. In other words, either it's okay or it's a full-blown addiction. We want to think about the spectrum of sexual struggle. As you start this recovery journey, you want to think about how serious is this? What's really going on in my life? And when we do workshops and when I work with clients, one of the things that sometimes happens, and this was the case in my own life, is that we'll spend a lot of time, or the clients will spend a lot of time trying to determine whether or not this is really an addiction or if it's just a bad habit. And somewhere in that middle ground, we lose sight of the fact that addiction insights can be helpful to us to understand and to make interventions in what's happening in our lives. So I'm going to use the addiction language a lot, but recognize that some people may not identify with that, and that's fine. If you don't think you're an addict or you don't want to call yourself an addict, I don't know that that's necessarily that big of a deal, as long as we recognize there's something that's out of control, or there's some way in which I struggle to maintain my my boundaries around this. Now, whatever label you want to put on that, it's up to you. But so let's talk about this from a standpoint of the spectrum of sexual struggle. So enjoy. As people come up or come to me when we start working together, and they'll have questions like, how would you define sex addiction? Can you have an addiction to pornography? If someone's into pornography, does that make them an addict? If you have an affair, does that make you an addict? How many? If someone has multiple affairs, how do you draw that line? How do you know when someone is a sex addict or not? Now, I want to say before I go further here, I have written about this in a book, Reclaiming Sexual Sanity. I make this available for free on the website, sexualsanity.com, so you might want to check that out. There's a section in there about sort of talking about the defining characteristics of addictions and then seeing how they might apply to sexuality. But in this training, I want to have us look at it a little bit of a different way. And I love Susan Cheever's quote about this. She says, "For all the definitions that have been written by the hundreds of addiction specialists and doctors, addiction is still mysterious and baffling. In many cases, it's hard to tell if someone is an addict or just a passionate amateur." And I couldn't agree more. I find it helpful to think of this like a continuum. Instead of either or, think of it like a continuum between healthy sexuality on the one hand and addiction or compulsivity on the other. Now, healthy sexuality, I suppose we could probably all feel like we have a basic understanding of that. And then there's, if you see on that continuum, a line there between healthy sexuality and unhealthy sexuality. There's a fairly straightforward distinction, or there's a line that we cross where we realize this is not right, this is not healthy. As Christians, we can think about sexual purity, and then we move into something that would be sexual impurity or sexual sin. If you think about the analogy between alcohol use and alcohol abuse or alcohol misuse, you might apply that same kind of thinking here to sexual use or sexual experiences, and then misuse of sex or problematic
kind of behaviors. But then there's another category we move into, and there's not a clear defining line between them, where we move from unhealthy sexuality to addictive sexuality or compulsive sexuality. And again, using Christian language, we might think in terms here of being in bondage to a sin rather than just committing a sin, but it's like now this is starting to have a control over us, and dependency, a term I'm going to come back to in a little bit. But so many people, maybe it's a large part of our population, can move from healthy sexuality into unhealthy sexuality or commit sexual sin, but at a certain point then decide, this is not the right thing. I don't want to do this. I don't want to live this way, so I'm not going to. And they stop, and they sort of dial it back. But there's other people that are engaging in unhealthy sexual behavior, sinful behavior, and they decide I need to change this, but they can't. They keep going back to it. And I suppose we might say, most anyone can stop. We can sort of pull back the reins for a little while, but the problem is we can't stay stopped. We keep going back to it. And that's where we realize this is not simply unhealthy. This is not simply sinful behavior. There's a compulsion here. There's some kind of bondage here. And again, some people are uncomfortable using the term addiction here. And I just want to say, whatever you want to call it, there's something going on. Now, Roshbeth Ewald has a great sort of bottom line definition of sexual addiction. And let me just read it. She says, sexual addicts are those who engage in persistent and escalating patterns of sexual behavior acted out despite increasingly negative consequences to themselves and to others. So a couple of things there. It's a persistent pattern, but it's also an escalating pattern. We see that things seem to get worse over time. And then these are things that we do despite negative consequences. And even though it's getting us in trouble, even though it's hurting us, hurting other people, and we don't want to do it at some level, but we keep doing it. That would be addiction. And then she adds the neurochemical component. They become addicted to the neurochemical changes that take place in the body during sexual behavior. Now, our approach would simply be, we want to insist that we have honesty and clarity about the behavior, and we're not going to get hung up on the sex addiction label. So the question is your sexual behavior causing problems in your life? If so, then let's address it. Let's deal with it. And I personally like the concept of dependency, to say that over time, what happens is, especially when we are introduced to sexuality at a young age, and there are challenges and problems in our lives that cause us to be looking for some kind of outside solution to help us, deal with the pain or help us overcome the boredom or relieving the stress or just making us relieving that feeling of emptiness. So we're searching for these outside solutions. If sexuality comes into play there, and we start to turn to those sexual behaviors, and we find comfort, or somehow they enable us or help us to cope, over time we become dependent on those things. And that's maybe a better way to think about this. Not so much addiction, but dependency on a behavior to help us cope with life.